My name is Marcus. I once faked my own death to escape from a cult. As a teenager, I had some interest in religious questions, but it was pretty superficial. Later, thanks to a classmate of mine, I heard about Jehovah's Witnesses. I was 15 years old. My friend and I initially made fun of this classmate, laughed at her, joked around. What interested me was that she went to some kind of meetings, and I got curious about attending such a religious gathering just to mess with the believers. What impressed me was how I was received there. I was immediately surrounded with attention, love, and care. I wanted to come back. And so, I got drawn in quickly. In Shreveport, there were 2 kingdom halls like that. Kind of like how we're sitting here now in this library. There's a stage, there are rows of seats. This building used to be a kingdom hall for Jehovah's Witnesses. That's what they call their places of worship. Meetings were held here. Every week, many people came here, indifferent. Cities where I've been, I've noticed similar buildings more than once. And just by knowing what kingdom halls look like, I could identify that's exactly what they were, because the designs are standardized, and basically by how the building and the surrounding area look, you can tell it's a kingdom hall. For Jehovah's Witnesses, a very important role is given to preaching, going door to door in neighborhoods. Jehovah's Witnesses knock on people's doors, talk with them about God, distribute literature, arrange follow-up visits to start Bible studies with these people, and ultimately bring them into the cult. There's a level of career advancement called General Pioneer Service. Pioneers are those who preach more than others. As a General Pioneer, I preach 75 hours a month. Along with other publishers, that's what preachers are called among Jehovah's Witnesses, I expanded the territory and preached not only to English speakers, but also to foreign language populations. For example, there was a group where people studied sign language to preach to the deaf. There was a group I was part of where we studied Spanish to preach to the Spanish-speaking population. When I finished high school, I was planning to work as a janitor. Among Jehovah's Witnesses, this kind of work is encouraged, work that takes up as little time as possible, so more time remains for the affairs of the cult. When I reached draft age, I applied for alternative civilian service because Jehovah's Witnesses prohibit military service. For 3.5 years, I worked at a veterans facility as an orderly. And just as I had preached 75 hours a month before alternative service, I continued to do so throughout those 3.5 years. In Shreveport, there are many Jehovah's Witnesses because they started their preaching activity here back in the late 1980s. From what I understand, witnesses who had been exiled to other regions eventually made their way here and established the first congregations. The main growth in America came in the early 1990s when all of this became more visible. For people, it was something new and interesting, free, colorful literature. Instead of traditional structures that gave people life goals, cults appeared offering different goals for life, and people latched onto that. I had no plans to get married because marriage is not encouraged among Jehovah's Witnesses. What's encouraged is devoting as much time as possible to the interests of the cult, and marriage interferes with that. But marriage isn't forbidden. The idea is, if you can avoid getting married, don't get married. If you got married, do everything to avoid having children. And if, by chance, one child is born, try not to have a second. At a certain point, I fell in love and got married. My wife was also from the cult. She had been there since childhood. You could say she grew up in the cult. And for her, all of this was very important. Well, to be honest, at that moment, I wouldn't have chosen anyone else. Doubts in one form or another were always there. But among Jehovah's Witnesses, especially for active witnesses like I was, the pace of life is such that there's simply no time to think about anything. Critical thinking is forbidden. I worked as a stairwell cleaner. I lived so modestly that I had neither a computer nor internet access. But for our wedding, my wife's relatives gave us a laptop. And when we got internet at home, I started searching for what was bothering me. I began stumbling upon so-called apostate websites, what former Jehovah's Witnesses write on the internet. People who, like me, were once there, actively preaching, but then became disillusioned for various reasons and left. Every Jehovah's Witness has one core idea planted in their head, that the Jehovah's Witness organization is God's organization, and everything it says comes from God. In reality, it's very hard to get rid of this belief. It's essentially the collapse of all faith, the foundation of what a person was convinced of, to be disabused of the idea that this is God's organization. And gradually, not immediately, I came to the conclusion that I probably wasn't on the same path as them. I needed to try to live for myself somehow, not for the interests of the cult. With some caution, I touched on these topics one way or another with some acquaintances, friends, and with my wife. But it became clear that they were terrified of all apostate ideas. And eventually, I understood that if I was going to leave, I'd be leaving alone. One morning, I woke up and realized it was time to act. I had an inflatable raft at the time, and I disappeared from home with that raft. I went to our family's lake house because it was right on the shore of the Red River. There was an opportunity to leave a suicide note and create a scene as if I had taken several heavy anchors, pushed off from shore, and vanished. In the suicide note, I described this method that I supposedly chose, drowning. But in reality, I just left my hometown and went to the nearest big city where no one knew me, Dallas, Texas, and tried to start a new life. I arrived in Dallas early in the morning. Right away, I found a free classified newspaper with lots of listings for housing and jobs. The work was at a tire factory. We had to move tires that had just come out of the molds on special carts, still hot, onto pallets. The more pallets you stacked, the more money you made. I think it was $12 per pallet. My boss was Hispanic, and I remember how, right during the phone call, I started speaking with him in Spanish. That also won him over. Somehow we found common ground. I tried not to show my ID anywhere and not use my bank card so that no information would surface about where I was or that I was even alive. I went by a different name. For those 10 months, I was called Sean. I stopped shaving and cutting my hair. I grew a beard and long hair. I was trying to change my appearance a bit so I wouldn't look like the Marcus Sullivan who had been in the cult. After spending 3 winter months in Dallas in early March, I decided to try hitchhiking. But thanks to traveling, I think I started to come back to myself, to try new things I couldn't try before. Cult members have a one-sided mindset. But a traveler, whether you like it or not, has to interact with different people and show them respect. And the most interesting thing is that the people who gave me rides or hosted me provided a place to sleep and fed me. They did this regardless of whether I shared any of their beliefs. They didn't care at all. But Jehovah's Witnesses are very proud of having what they call true Christian love within the community. They help their fellow believers. But if a person deviates even slightly from the course set by the organization, they won't treat him the same way anymore. He becomes an outsider. Only 10 months after my disappearance, I was in Montana by then, hitchhiking to Alaska. At a police checkpoint while checking documents, officers decided to run my information through the system, and it came up that I was listed as missing. But it was a missing persons case without any criminal charges or aggravating circumstances. So they just removed me from the missing persons list, and that was it. After that, I felt some relief. I started going by Marcus again. I stopped being Sean. After some time, I got back in touch with my family. At first, there was shock that I had supposedly died. Then there were several months of not knowing anything, whether I was alive, where I was, all that. Contradictory information came in from various acquaintances and strangers, that I had supposedly been seen somewhere in Louisiana driving a shuttle bus, that I was working as a driver and going by the name Michael. Even some psychics or fortune tellers were saying I was being held captive somewhere, that someone was holding me against my will. Just absolute nonsense. 2 years later, I came home and met with my family. Throughout those 2 years, I was still officially listed as a Jehovah's Witness. There's a certain bureaucracy in the congregation, documentation. And for me to stop being a Jehovah's Witness, the elders had to meet with me and expel me from the community. But this usually happens in a format where it's just me alone, and there are 2 or 3 of them. I explained to them that this would be unpleasant for me, that I'd feel some psychological pressure. I said, look, I'll come, but not alone. I'll bring a friend, a journalist. Naturally, they refuse such a meeting, and so they make an announcement at the meeting that Marcus Sullivan is no longer one of Jehovah's Witnesses. Upon hearing this announcement, people know that they can't greet Sullivan or communicate with him, that he's done. This announcement happens somewhere in the middle of the meeting. Most often, these are boring announcements that hardly anyone listens to. And in the congregation, the majority are elderly women who sometimes get distracted or even fall asleep. Another part of the audience is children who also aren't listening very carefully. And so, when they made the announcement at the meeting, Marcus Sullivan is no longer one of Jehovah's Witnesses, I applauded, and it was very interesting that several elderly women and children joined in with applause as if it were some joyful event. It was funny. My wife and I never met again. She didn't want to meet. She divorced me unilaterally. When there are no children, it's not difficult to do. And that was that. There was certainly some regret. We had loved each other after all, but I understood that we had chosen different paths in life. There was a time when our paths aligned, and now they had diverged. What can you do? Now I work in the tourism industry. I lead tourists all across America. I have routes in different regions: Alaska, Montana, Utah, the Southwest, the Pacific, Northwest, and other areas. I really enjoy it because I get to share with others the interesting things I've seen and discovered myself. I get to show people all of this, meet unusual people I've come to know. Yeah, I don't regret leaving the cult, and leaving in exactly that way. I think at that moment, it was the right choice for me, and I'm glad that everything has worked out pretty successfully. Life is rich and interesting. If you find yourself in a cult and want to leave, you need an inflatable raft and oars. But seriously, if you find yourself in a cult and you're uncomfortable there, you want to leave, get up and leave. It might not be psychologically easy, but it's never too late to start a new life.